The 1970s were different, not just culturally, not just politically, but cinematically. Hollywood was in the middle of something that has never quite happened again. A window of creative freedom so unusual, so unrepeatable, that the films it produced still feel like they came from another world entirely. Directors had power, studios took risks, audiences were willing to be uncomfortable. And the result? Films that pushed into territory that no major production today would dare enter. Not because the stories weren't worth telling, but because the way they were told, raw, unfiltered, and completely unafraid, would be almost impossible to replicate inside the modern system. Some of these films were banned, some were protested, some sparked legal battles that lasted years. And yet, decades later, we're still talking about them, not just as controversial curiosities, but as some of the most important, most challenging, and most unforgettable films ever made. These are the 11 films from the 1970s that would never be made today. A Clockwork Orange. Some films disturb you, others stay with you long after the screen goes dark, sitting somewhere uncomfortable in your mind, refusing to leave. A Clockwork Orange does both. Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Anthony Burgess's novel arrived in 1971 and immediately created a storm that had no clean resolution. The story follows Alex, a young man whose passion for violence and chaos becomes the centerpiece of a deeply unsettling psychological journey. But it's not just what happens in the film, it's how Kubrick makes you watch it. The violence is stylized, almost beautiful in the way it's presented, and that's exactly what makes it so disturbing. Because you're not just witnessing something terrible, you're being asked to sit with it, to observe it without the comfort of easy moral judgment. The film was pulled from UK distribution by Kubrick himself, reportedly due to threats and a cultural panic that had grown around it. It didn't return to British screens until after his death. That says everything about the kind of impact it had. Today, a studio film featuring a protagonist this morally unredeemable, presented with this much style and this little apology, would face a wall of resistance before a single frame was shot. A Clockwork Orange wasn't just controversial, it was a challenge. And the cinema world has never quite recovered from it. Last Tango in Paris. There are films that push boundaries, and then there are films that erase them entirely. Last Tango in Paris, directed by Bernardo Bertolucci and starring Marlon Brando, arrived in 1972 like a collision. Raw, intimate, and deeply uncomfortable in ways that critics and audiences were completely unprepared for. On the surface, it tells the story of two strangers who begin a purely physical relationship in a Paris apartment. No names, no histories, no emotional attachment. But what unfolds beneath that premise is something far more complex. A meditation on grief, on isolation, on the way human beings use each other to escape pain they can't face directly. Brando's performance is unlike anything he had done before, or would do again. It feels less like acting and more like exposure, like something genuinely private being brought into the open. The film was banned in several countries. Italy actually convicted Bertolucci on obscenity charges. The negative was ordered to be destroyed. And yet it survived. Because even through the controversy, perhaps because of it, the film was impossible to dismiss. Today, the conversation around Last Tango in Paris has deepened with new information and new ethical questions about how it was made. That conversation is important, but it doesn't erase what the film represented as a piece of cinema. A moment when intimacy on screen felt genuinely dangerous, and the industry looked away. Deliverance. Not every film that disturbs you does so through excess. Some do it through honesty. Deliverance, released in 1972 and directed by John Borman, is one of the most quietly devastating films ever made. Not because it shocks you at every turn, but because it makes you feel the weight of what its characters are carrying. Four men from the city decide to canoe through a remote stretch of river in Georgia before a dam floods it forever. What begins as an adventure becomes something else entirely. The film is famous for a scene that is still difficult to watch. But what's often forgotten is everything that surrounds it. The slow build of tension, the unfamiliar landscape, the creeping sense that these men are somewhere they were never meant to be. Borman doesn't dramatize the violence for effect. He presents it with a bluntness that forces you to confront it. And then he asks something harder. What do you do afterward? How do you carry something like that home? The, the performances, particularly from Jon Voight and Burt Reynolds, feel less like acting and more like survival. Today, a studio would sand down the edges, add resolution, make the ending cleaner. Deliverance refuses all of that. It ends the way trauma ends. Not with closure, but with something you simply have to learn to live with. And that's exactly why it couldn't be made the same way today. Straw Dogs. There are films that make you uncomfortable. And then there are films that make you uncomfortable about yourself. Straw Dogs, directed by Sam Peckinpah and released in 1971, falls firmly into the second category. Dustin Hoffman plays a mild-mannered American academic who moves to a remote English village with his wife. From the beginning, something feels off. The locals are hostile. The tension is quiet but constant. And Hoffman's character, intellectual, passive, conflict avoidant, seems completely out of place. Then the film begins to ask a question. What is a man capable of when everything is taken from him? Peckinpah's answer is brutal, complex, and deeply unsettling. Not because of the violence itself, but because of how the film frames it. The final act, in which Hoffman's character defends his home, is designed to make you feel conflicted. You might find yourself invested in the violence, and then immediately disturbed by that investment. That is the point. Straw Dogs was protested, restricted, and debated for years, particularly for a scene that remains one of the most controversial in cinema history. The conversation around it has evolved significantly over time, but the film's core question about violence, masculinity, and what lives beneath the surface of civilized behavior still has no comfortable answer, which is precisely why it wouldn't survive the modern development process unchanged. Some questions Hollywood has decided are better left unasked. The Last House on the Left. Some films exist at the edge of what cinema is willing to show. The Last House on the Left lives beyond that edge. Wes Craven's 1972 debut is not an easy film to discuss, and it was never meant to be. The story follows two teenage girls who encounter a group of escaped criminals. What happens next is presented with a rawness that feels less like filmmaking and more like documentation. Craven was deliberate about that choice. He wanted to remove the comfortable distance that horror usually provides. The stylized tension, the dramatic score, the sense that what you're watching is safely fictional. He wanted it to feel real, and it does. That's what made it so deeply controversial. Audiences who expected genre entertainment found something far more confrontational. Critics debated whether it had any artistic merit at all, or whether it was simply exploitation wearing a thin artistic disguise. Ebert himself had a complicated response to the film, acknowledging its power while questioning its purpose. Over time, The Last House on the Left has been revisited as an early example of a filmmaker using shock, not just for shock's sake, but to force an emotional reckoning. Whether that argument fully holds is something each viewer has to decide for themselves. But one thing is certain. In today's market, with its careful audience testing, trigger warnings, and studio risk management, a film this raw, this unprotected, this aggressively uncomfortable, that would never get made. Not like this. Scum. Not every film on this list came from Hollywood. Some of the most uncompromising cinema of the 1970s came from places the industry wasn't watching closely enough. Scum, directed by Alan Clark, began as a BBC television film in 1977 and was immediately banned before it could air. The content was considered too brutal, too honest, and too damaging to broadcast. So Clark remade it as a theatrical film in 1979. And it hit just as hard. The story takes place inside a British youth detention center, following a new arrival as he navigates a world of institutional violence, corrupt authority, and complete psychological brutality. Ray Winstone's performance in the lead role is one of the most raw, physical, and unnerving debuts in British cinema history. But what makes Scum truly remarkable isn't just the violence, it's the system. Clark wasn't interested in telling a story about one bad place. He was making an argument about institutional cruelty, about the way authority can be used not to reform, but to destroy. That argument was considered so dangerous that the original version was suppressed entirely. Today, the subject matter might survive in a carefully managed prestige drama. Softened, contextualized, given a redemptive arc. And what Clark made was none of those things. It was a brick through a window, and the establishment felt it. I spit on your grave. Some films don't just divide audiences, they divide the people who study film for a living. I Spit on Your Grave, released in 1978, is one of the most debated films in cinema history.
Not because the debate is easy, but because it genuinely isn't. The story follows a writer who retreats to a remote cabin, becomes the victim of a brutal attack, and then systematically takes revenge on those responsible. On the surface, it sounds like a straightforward exploitation film, but the conversation around it has never been straightforward. Some critics, including Roger Ebert, responded with genuine moral outrage. The argument was that the film lingered too long on suffering, that it presented violence against women not as something to be confronted, but as something to be consumed. Others pushed back. They argued that the film's unflinching approach was precisely the point, that making the audience sit with that discomfort was a deliberate act, not a careless one, that the revenge, when it comes, carries weight specifically because of what preceded it. Neither argument has fully won, and that unresolved tension is what keeps the film alive in critical conversation decades later. Today, a film tackling this subject would be packaged very differently, framed carefully, positioned as empowerment, given a score that tells you how to feel. I Spit on Your Grave doesn't tell you how to feel. It leaves you alone with it, and for many viewers, that is the most uncomfortable thing of all. Taxi Driver. Not every film on this list is controversial because of explicit content. Some are dangerous for a completely different reason. Taxi Driver, released in 1976 and directed by Martin Scorsese, is one of the greatest films ever made. It is also one of the most deeply unsettling portraits of a human mind ever committed to screen. Travis Bickle, played by Robert De Niro in a performance that still defines what screen acting can be, is not a hero. He's not a villain in any simple sense either. He is something more troubling than both. A man unraveling quietly in plain sight, isolated, delusional, and building towards something that the film refuses to condemn as cleanly as audiences might want. Scorsese and writer Paul Schrader were exploring something specific, the psychology of alienation, of a mind that has disconnected from reality and rebuilt its own moral framework from the wreckage. The film was nominated for the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It changed cinema. And it also inspired real-world events that still shadow its legacy. Today, a studio film with a protagonist this morally unresolved, this deliberately unreliable, would face enormous pressure to be fixed, to be clarified, to give audiences somewhere safe to stand. Taxi Driver offers no such safety. It puts you inside a broken mind and leaves you there. And when the credits roll, the discomfort doesn't end. It follows you out of the room. The 1970s gave cinema something that has never fully returned. Permission. Permission to be uncomfortable, to be unresolved, to trust audiences with darkness that had no tidy explanation and no guaranteed redemption. The films on this list didn't all succeed by every measure. Some were deeply flawed. Some remain genuinely difficult to defend in certain respects. Some exist in a moral gray area that honest discussion can't fully resolve. But they were made. Completely, unapologetically, without the safety nets that now surround every major production. And that matters. Because cinema, at its most powerful, has never been about comfort. It has been about truth. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that sits with you. The kind that doesn't let go. The 1970s understood that, and somewhere between the test screenings, the audience analytics, and the franchise planning, we forgot. These films are a reminder of what gets lost when safety becomes the highest priority, not just great filmmaking, but the courage to look at the hardest parts of human experience and refuse to look away.